In Module 4 of our series, we learned how to create character animation via hierarchies and parenting. This is the most common way for us to connect and control different layers from one single point. However, sometimes in a pinch, we have the need to create character animation or the animation of different things via a faster workflow called the Puppet tool. The Puppet tool works much like a marionette works in the real world. That is, you basically create pins of reference as to where you're going to create motion, and then you use those pins to control the puppet. So let's take a look at this set of tools. So for this, I'm going to create a composition, and I'm just simply going to put in a PNG of an old man standing on one leg. So in order to animate this character, you see this is one single picture. What we want to do is we want to apply pins of different kinds around the body to determine the different limbs or the different places where we want to create motion. So to do that, we use this set of tools that's under the Puppet tool pin right here. So let's keep that click for just a second and let's walk through the different tools. The first tool is called the Position Pin tool, which you can figure out by the name, allows you to work the position of a point where you place a pin within the image or within the layer that you are targeting. This Puppet Starch tool allows you to stiffen areas of the puppet. So if you're seeing that there's a lot of deformation based on the position changes on the position pins, then you can starch certain areas and they get stiff within the actual definition of what you do with the pins, which is basically the program will create a grid where it involves the subject that you're trying to pin out of the picture. So what that means is basically you define a grid area around it, and then the image itself is mapped onto that grid, and you're actually controlling the grid through those pins. You'll see that in just a second. Then you have the Puppet Bend tool, Puppet Bend Pin tool, which allows you to bend or rotate a certain area, a certain pin that you place. Then you have the Advanced Pin tool, which is basically a compilation of the three that are up here. It's one, except for the Starch tool. It doesn't work for starch. It works for bending and position changes. And you have the Overlap Pin tool, which allows you to define areas that overlap over one another. So we'll see what that does in just a second. So to start, what I want to do is I want to use the Position Pin tool. So let's go ahead and select that one, and you'll notice that as soon as I click on the subject, let's say I want to click pin on the shoulder here, and I want to click another one in the hand, let's say. Now you notice that this is creating pins. Basically, it's creating these little points of reference. And if you notice under my layer, I am getting a new filter, which is called the Puppet filter. Now you don't find the Puppet as a filter in here. It's actually activated through the set of tools. And under the mesh, the drop-down area here, you see that there's something called density, expansion, deform, but you don't see any mesh. The reason is because by default, it is deactivated. So if you want to see what mesh was created by my setting these two pins, click here on Mesh, Show Mesh, and you'll notice that this creates basically a mesh around the subject defined by whatever you place the pin tool first. Now, the program does that automatically for you. The AI and the program allows you to do this. And you can increase the amount of subdivisions in the mesh by increasing the expansion. For example, let's go to, actually 10 is too high a number. Let's go 7. And you'll notice that it starts increasing the amount of triangles that you see. I would keep it at default start. And then you can increase the density of that as well. Oh, sorry, the expansion is, or sorry, I saw them backwards. Expansion expands the reach of the grid. So if I go 10, you'll notice that it grows out 10 pixels outside of the subject itself. And then if I increase the density, let's say to 15, you'll notice that I created a lot more triangles into this. So if you're working, you notice that it only goes up to 12. I enter 15 and it only will up to 12. Now, if you go lower, then you get much bigger triangles and a lesser amount of triangles. Let's go ahead and hit return with 5, you'll see. And so the reason for this is because the more density that you have, the smoother the deformations that you're going to apply to the subject. While if you have a lower amount, then you basically have bigger chunks of the artwork being mapped out to the triangles. Therefore, your animation could look clunky. So you need to find a happy medium. If you increase your density, you're asking the RAM in your machine to calculate quite a bit. If you've ever done work with 3D programs, you know exactly what this means. Basically, you're increasing the amount of triangles or faces within the subject. That's basically the same principle. So now, let's go ahead, and you can keep the mesh on while you're working if you want to, although it can get on the way if you are working. So let me go ahead and create more position keyframes. Let me actually do one here, and one here on the foot, and one here in the arm, and another one in this hand. Okay, so what do these pins do? Well, when I'm creating these points under the puppet itself, if I go under the puppet tool here, if I go ahead and look in detail, let me go ahead and press the U key under select layer and press U. You'll notice that under deform, under mesh, I get a whole list of pins, puppet pins. Each one corresponds to each one of the pins that I set up in the character in the layer, and they basically allow me to access their position value from here if I want to. You will also notice that by simply placing the pin, I also created a keyframe. The program creates a keyframe for me, so I don't have to create a keyframe. It automatically knows that I want a keyframe as soon as I click on the object. So that's something that the program does for you, and it basically sets it up whatever your time marker happens to be. That's one thing. These are position keyframes. So if I go to one of those points, one of those pins, and I start moving them around, you'll notice that the subject starts moving around the different pins as a rubber hose animation, basically. And you can capture this, actually. You can capture the motion. Let me undo this. Let's see what happens if I do this here. You'll notice that it starts stretching and contracting the artwork based on how it maps onto the mesh. You need to be careful because if you overdo this, you obviously, as you can see, the character gets deformed as you go. Let me turn off the mesh up here really quick so you can see what deformation it makes on the subject. So you have to be very careful as to how much you actually change the values of those pins. However, there are tools that help you work this around this. For example, let's say I want to move this, you'll notice how this gets deformed heavily. So what if I want to move this down a little bit, but I don't want it to get as deformed? Well, under the tools, you have something called the Starch Pin tool. So in order to not deform that, let me go ahead and deform it first so you can see it. So you see that there's some kind of change around here. Let me go ahead and go to the tool again, and so the shortcut to cycle through all of these tools is Control P. So if you're in the position tool and you press Control P on the, or Command P on the Mac, you'll notice that you basically circle through all the tools up here. So that's the Starch tool, the one that looks like an actual pin. If I click on that, that gives you another pin. When I click on it, you'll notice that this got straight again. Let me undo that really quick. You'll see how it's deformed. Now let me click on it. You'll see how it got straight again. Now if I move this, that portion doesn't deform as much as it did before. And the reason for that is because this starts in triangles around that area. It's forcing triangles around that area not to deform. That's basically what it's doing. So if you want to avoid a lot of deformation around a specific motion point or a bending point, you can set different starch points. And as you can see, I have motion, and that area is basically protecting the face from deforming too much. You still get some deformation, but not as much as you did before. Now, let's go ahead and look at the next pin over here, which is the bend, the puppet bend pin tool. And at this point, I'm going to select that one. Let me go ahead and try to create a bending point right here in the knee. So when I do this, notice that I get a little circle around it, which allows me to rotate the value of that pin. So I can create very fluid rubber hose animation with this. Once again, once I click on that, you'll notice that it keeps on creating pins for me. If I open up that pin, notice that it tells me that's a starch pin, starch pin. The next one over here is a position pin, and so on. So it tells me the type of pin that you have been setting up for each one of these. Notice that the latest one, which was pin 11, it's a bend pin. But you'll also notice that you have a drop-down menu here, which allows you to switch that really quick to any of the previous options: position, starch, or bend. Now, the advanced pin tool contains both position and rotation in one. So let me go ahead and delete that pin. So to delete a pin, simply select it and hit the delete key on the keyboard, or you can delete it from the list over here. Select it and delete it. Now let's go to the Control P to jump on to the next tool, which is this one, the advanced pin tool, the one that looks like a can opener pin. And so if I click in the same knee, you'll notice that I have both the ability to do motion, and I also have the ability to do rotation, and I also have the ability to scale. So this allows me to do all three operations in one, basically. It gives me the ability to change three transformation values for wherever that pin happens to be placed, which is extremely helpful, okay? And again, very fluid. As with the other ones, it created a pin, and it tells me what type it is, and notice that it contains the three different attributes or three different transformation values that I can change for that particular pin. Now, the last one over here is the overlap pin. And the overlap pin has to do with how the artwork is represented on the screen, meaning what areas do you want to go behind and what areas you want to go in front. So what does that mean? Well, let's take a look at this arm right here for this old man. When I move this arm down, you'll notice that it starts sort of cutting off, especially around this area right there. You'll notice that the baton is kind of like cutting through his skin and through his pants. And that is because this is a flat image. This is a PNG, as you can see. Let me go back over here. It is a PNG. So the program doesn't know how to interpret this. This is flat. So as far as the program goes, all of these, if this was placed in Z space, this would be all in Z space. So it doesn't know which one goes in front, which one goes in back, and it just makes an arbitrary decision. Now, to define what you want to go in front or back, you use that tool, the last tool here, the Puppet Overlap Pin tool. Now, you'll notice that this, when you select that tool, it actually shows you an outline of the original artwork. And that is to tell you, okay, based on the artwork that you have created, that you had originally, it's telling you, select where you want overlapping areas. So I want this whole area to be an overlapping area, especially around the bottom portion of the baton. So I want to go ahead and place a pin tool around here somewhere towards the bottom. Now, you'll notice that this creates a blue type of pin, and it automatically colorizes this and starts gradating as it goes away from that blue pin tool. That is because that area that has been painted defines the area that's going to be in front, which is changed by this value up here at the top. And you can actually go from front, which is any value in the positive numbers, or you can go all the way to negative numbers. You'll notice that it now gets dark, which means it's going to be behind in the shadow. So if I were to move the baton now, because of this definition of values, it's going to say, okay, then go ahead and move whatever area happens to be in the dark behind whatever artwork it happens to come across. So when I move this, the tool, the actual pin over here, let me switch my tool to, actually, I'll switch it to my selection tool. If I select this pin tool right here, the one that I have for the bottom of the baton, let me go ahead and select it. Oops, I keep on selecting the layer. I apologize. So that would have been nice to take note of what pin I was, because I can't see it. I cannot see a yellow pin on a yellow ball. It's kind of difficult to see. So, okay, Charlie didn't put a pin tool. I put it in the arm. Sorry, my bad. So let me go ahead and move it from here. Now you'll notice that the baton goes behind, and that is because I told the artwork through this pin tool, through the overlap pin, that artwork was supposed to go behind. Now let me go back to that tool again and select that tool, the pin over here, the blue pin, which is the overlap pin, and let me go to the positive numbers. Let me go up to like 180 or something like that. And now let me go back and move my pin. Be careful when using the different kinds of pins, especially this pin, the overlap pin, because the overlap pin is on a mode of its own. So you'll notice that my pin doesn't change settings even if I roll over the other pins. So if I were to click, I will set up a pin there, which is not my intention. What I want to do is move it. So one of two things you can do. You can switch back to your arrow tool by clicking on the arrow. You can press the V key on the keyboard, V as in Victor, to switch to the selection tool. Or you can press Control P to switch back to your first pin tool, to the position pin tool, which allows you then to click and select. Now you notice because we moved it to the front value, to the positive value on this puppet tool right here, on the blue tool, the blue pin, we moved it to 81%. Now that area overlaps in front. This extends the amount of influence that pin has over triangles around it. So it'll start expanding, and that's why you see some grain toward the edges. which means that that area is not likely to overlap as much as whatever is closest to the pin. If I reduce it substantially, you'll notice that it gets smaller and smaller and the gray area gets closer to the blue pin tool. So you got to make sure that you balance out how much you want this thing to go so that it covers the actual overlapping areas. And then when you are done with the overlap options, then you can come back and create the animation. Now, with that done, it works just like any keyframe. So what does that mean? Well, let me go ahead and fit to 100. I want to go ahead and with this, let's assume that this is my beginning point. Then I'm going to move to the 1 second mark, actually to 15 frames. And then I'm going to start moving some of these pins. Let me go ahead and move this here. Let me move that up here. Let me move this guy here. Maybe this guy down here. I want to rotate this guy a little bit. And I want to bring this guy down here like this. Perhaps I want to move that a little bit as well. And I want to move this guy down like so. And I want to move this guy down here like this. So you'll notice that making those changes automatically created keyframes. Then I'm going to go to the beginning point. I'm going to select all of my keyframes. So I'm going to go and expand this up so we can see all of the keyframes. And this is one of the drawbacks of using the puppet tool. Every time you lay a pin, basically you have another item to deal with within your layer. It's quite a lot of them. So let me go ahead and copy all those. So I select them all by dragging a selection across all of them. Select them by pressing Control-C, and then let me press Control+V to paste them over here. And let me bring back my endpoint. Let's go ahead and do a quick render on this and see what kind of animation we get. So that's fine. I mean, it's plasticky. It's not tremendously exciting, but it's a lot of animation with a very little amount of work. Now, this gets better when you actually utilize the next tool, which is the record options. So let's take a look at what that does. Record options basically allows me to record at a specific percentage of speed based on whatever I am doing, and then it smooths out the animation based on the setting that I set up here. Lower values of smoothing create more clunky animation. Higher ones create smoother animation. Okay, now let's go ahead and take a look as to what this does. I'm going to click Show Mesh so that we can see what this is doing. So in order to create an animation, to create an actual capture, what you want to do is you want to pick a pin first and foremost. So I'm going to animate this guy because it's the most visible thing. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to press the Control key. Now you'll notice that as soon as I press the Control key, because I am in the Puppet tool, that my cursor changes to the little timer as I'm rolling over the pin. I haven't clicked on anything. The only thing I'm doing right now is pressing the Control key. Now let's keep the Control key pressed, and as soon as you start moving that pin, this is going to start recording how you move your mouse. So let me go ahead and move this, and you'll notice that basically it created keyframes for everything. Now let's assume that that's not what you wanted to do. Let's assume you wanted to only animate this particular pin. Well, let's go ahead and switch this off really quick. Select the object again, switch my move tool, my move pin, there it is. And what I want to do is I want to go ahead and find that pin again, which is here. That's the pin that I want to animate. And I want to go ahead and animate that again. So press Control, make sure that only that pin is selected. You'll notice that is the only one that's full. Everything else is circles, not points. And now when I'm doing this, this is collecting all the information, as you can see, creating keyframes for position changes. So when I play this back, you're going to see that my animation was captured completely. So basically, let me actually do this again. A little bit more elastic. So be careful when capturing with this. Let me undo that again. Press Control on the keyboard, and let's do this one instead. So that's now that guy's waving with that arm. Okay. So as long as you press Control, basically you're capturing, and it will keep on capturing as long as you have composition. So if I keep on going all the way to the 5 second mark, it's going to keep on capturing things. So let me actually do that really quick. And yeah, this is an old man arguing with some hooligan kids, and there it is. Now he's scratching himself, I guess. So Basically, the thing is that there is motion capture on this, and these are keyframes, which you can then treat as keyframes. So if you want to simplify them by, eliminating some of the keyframes, you can smooth them out if you want to, like we did in the past. If you go to the smoother, you can go ahead and say how many of those do you want. If you want smoother motion, if you want to have, let's say, higher tolerance, you can remove the amount of keyframes. I mean, it's completely up to you how you want to handle keyframes. You can smooth them out by pressing F9, selecting them all, and create more of a fluid thing. So point is that this captures your mouse or your Wacom tablet motion, your stylus motion when you're moving something while you're pressing control, which gives you a lot of flexibility on the way you can animate something fairly fast. So this is the Puppet tool.